Okay, we are on. I'm going to assume again. Anyway, Kawingane Walomwa, everybody. Welcome to the continuation of the Munsee-Delaware Nation history on May the 2nd, 2021. Ninda Shinzi Kike Mark Peters and Ninunjea Nalahi, the Munsee-Delaware Nation, up the river from Nahi, Yaquawi. And I can't believe it's actually been 1 year to the day since I began doing these history sessions. Seems more like about 5 years actually, but anyway, I was planning to get into the 1763 and on time period tonight when I ended last week, but haven't been notified of this 1 year anniversary this morning on my memories on Facebook. I thought I'd change plans and do a little review of the past year actually, and just kind of do that for now. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go all the way back to where I started in the first session, some 14,000 years ago, and go up to the point we left off last week in 1763. I hope to be able to do that in about an hour. But, when I first started this, about 30 years ago actually, I was asked to do some research for a very specific reason by our chief at the time, Leroy Dolson, and the council, and did what I needed to do in that area at that time. And as I got into what they asked me to do regarding specific parts of our history, I began to get more interested in learning even more, and my concentration at the time was in the 1800s and last half of the 1700s, but I started to go back from there and right back to Manhattan, which you see in the bottom left picture here, and even back to the Ice Age, which we're going to start into in a couple minutes. So, way back then, there was really only a handful of textbooks that were available by Herbert Kraft and C.A. Westlager and Earl Olmsted and Paul Wallace, and Robert Grumet was beginning to do a fair amount of work in that area as well, the person I've been following to a significant extent up until the 1750s. But I'm just going to check something here. But it looks like we're on. Just want to make sure there. But like I say, it's really wasn't a lot of information. This handful of texts that I mentioned, maybe a couple more that I'm missing. Definitely the Zeisberger and Heckewelder texts were available, and Lascille, George Henry Lascille, and there was just another, like I say, handful of master's and PhD theses that you could find. One in particular I recall is called Seeking Shelter by a man by the last name of Kjelberg. A very good thesis that I'm going to be referring to even as we go along here, not tonight, but at a later time. And there's also more articles and papers and such that were out there at that time, but very hard to find, really located in local areas where they were done. And it's really only through the internet now that I've been able to find many of those types of documents that are out there written about us and Delawares in general. And as well, there's just a number of new texts that have come along since then, probably a good 20 or more relating to the Munsees and Delawares. And endless new articles and theses. I get probably one every week on my in my email over the past 6 or 8 months since I hooked into this one particular site. And there's really just actually too much to read to be doing this as a hobby, as something just to learn. It's really a full-time job that someone could do to really go through it all and put it together. Even though I've gone through 43 sessions already, it's really just the tip of the iceberg of information that's out there now about us. And over the next sessions, I cannot even come close to covering all of the details that are available. There's endless pictures now and drawings, paintings, and maps that I can add into this what's called OBS software that I've been able to learn how to use, and sort of evolved since my first session when I was just simply reading off of prepared notes, and if I had to show a map or something, I had to do it over my camera like that. But now, I can just put them into this software, and they're easily available and easier to see, and I can expand, shrink them, move them around. So we've come a little bit of a way since the first session back on May 2nd, 2020. And we're going to continue on after tonight up until the present day. It's going to be a bit of a journey, but it is a little unfortunate that we can't really get into all these particular details. I mean, when I started, I was doing maybe 10 to 20 year periods at a time, and now it's down to like 5 years or so, just because there's so much more information to have to put into this that's available. But even then, going by 5 or 10 year periods, there's still a lot that's going to be left out. I'm going to try and get the general details, the general picture here, so we can have a good understanding. So anyway, like I say, this is a picture of Manhattan Island, a rendition, like a digital rendition, I guess you would call it, of Manhattan Island before contact. What it may very well have looked like, according to a lot of research that was put into making this this graphic by a man named Richard Sanderson. I know that's his last name. I'm not sure if it's his first name, but Mr. Sanderson, in a book called Manhattan, I believe. And Manhattan means, it's a Munsee word that means, from what I understand, a place where certain wood grows to make bows, actually. And that's where it comes from my understanding. When I first started, I heard other variations of what that meant, but this seems to be more than likely what it really means. So anyway, this is what things looked like perhaps at the time of contact. However, what's missing in this is probably the number of smoke from different villages, the smoke that would be rising from all the various villages that would have been in this area. And on the right is a map showing the general Delaware Lenape geographical area on the East Coast, going down to the state of Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and up into New York. The bottom darker areas, the Unami and other nations, Nanticoke and other nation areas. And the top lighter area is what's called the Munsee-speaking people area, and it goes from over in Connecticut down to Long Island and to the Raritan River, basically, in New Jersey, and all the way over west of the Delaware River, almost to the Susquehanna, and north up to an area in Kingston on the Hudson River where the Esopus people are traditionally from. So, to another scene here. Well, the first session I started, I referred to a legend called the Legend of the Yaquawi. And it talked about the Yaquawi being a large animal that was put on the earth by Kishalmokwang to provide food to the people, and that the Yaquawi got a little testy and decided to make war on the people and all the animals in the area. And the Yaquawi got stuck in the bogs in this area at the time and basically drowned, was killed. I'm sure must have been killed, actually. And the blood from this Yaquawi filled the water and made it red, and that's the reason cranberries are red till this day, to remind people of this great battle that took place. Got the wind blowing through my window here. But this is a legend, Delaware legend, and the Yaquawi is the Mastodon, which you see here in this top middle picture. You know that the Yaquawi, or the Mastodon, went extinct probably at least 8,000 years ago. And whether this legend continued on from that time or not is really hard to say. I suppose from our point of view it did, although there is a possibility that people simply saw the remains of these animals over time, because hundreds of them have been found in the New Jersey area and New York. And that could be where the story came from as well. In fact, there's a location known as Chemung on the upper Susquehanna. We've been talking about it quite a bit. It's also called Willawana, and it's where the Munsees were living for quite some time after we were pushed over that way. And Chemung means bighorn in Delaware generally, but Willawana means bighorn specifically in Munsee, and it refers to a large mastodon tusk that was found in that area during the time that we began to live there, and that's why it was named Chemung or Willawana, because of this huge mammoth tusk that, and others had been found in that area since then. It's just an interesting story. But at the time, we're going back to the Ice Age now, about 12,000, 14,000 years ago. These are the kind of animals that lived in this area at the time. You see the mastodon, mammoth. One had kind of long hair, the other one didn't, and one lived more in the wooded area than the other lived more on the plains. You see the saber-toothed tiger at the bottom left, the giant short-faced bear in the middle beside the outline of a man, just showing how big it was. And on the right, you see the large caribou with the large horns. Again, the short-faced bear, the giant sloth, mastodon, and there's also a giant beaver that was probably as big as this saber-toothed tiger. And oops, missing a scene here. Okay, here we go. Anyway, this is the extent of the ice, the glaciers that covered half of North America during this time period. And you can see on the right just a general geographical picture of North America with the ice coming down basically to the 49th parallel that divides Canada and the U.S. But in this other map, you can see more specifically where it comes to in the New York area, all the way south of Manhattan and Long Island, and to basically the Delaware Water Gap where the Munsees are traditionally from. And you'll see what's called the continental shelf there, and you'll see a line between the ocean and the Delaware River. That's the outline of the present continent, or where the ocean comes to the shore now. But this continental shelf area is underwater now, and it extended probably a good 100 or more miles out into the ocean than it does today. When the ice melted, the ocean rose and covered that continental shelf. So it's quite possible there's a lot of archaeological type of evidence of occupation and other things that went on during this time period that are now underwater. And I understand they've even dredged up the remains of mastodons in this continental shelf, showing that life did occupy that area as well. Now, this picture in the middle, all these points, projectiles we'll call them, shows, and the dates are hard to see, but the bottom row of points are what they call Clovis Points, or fluted points, and they're dated back to about 12,000 or even 14,000 years ago. And the one on the left is an example of one that was actually found in this area from this time period, showing that human beings occupied this area during the time when all those large fauna or animals were still living there, but they're all extinct now. However, people continued to live and survive there after these large mammals and animals had gone extinct. And like I say, these projectile points show a continuous occupation from that Ice Age time period until today. The development, fine-tuning of these points continues up to the top, which is probably, just a few hundred years ago. And on the right is an example of more tools that were developed during this time period as well. People were basically hunters and gatherers, hunting these big, large animals when they could. And there's lots of evidence to show that First Nations in North America hunted mastodons, and it must have been quite the adventure and rather difficult thing to do to kill a mastodon with these types of weapons. In fact, there's no way anybody could simply throw a spear with these points and get it through the hide of a mastodon and into its vital organs. The only way you could do that is by having a group of people, some who can distract the animal in some way, and one or two others who can go up and thrust a spear right through the hide and into the vital organs. And likely some people were injured quite severely in these attempts, but it must have been quite the story to be able to tell when they got home to everyone, and that may be how this legend of the Yaquawi was handed down over so many years, if that's what happened. It's quite interesting. We weren't able to. When I first started these, like I said, I didn't have this OBS software, it's called, so I couldn't put these types of pictures on for people to see. So it's kind of nice to be able to do that now and go over it again and see these types of things. And this is a scene of village life during this time period, perhaps. Got a scene of people on the bottom, the making of a longhouse, and people out working and doing things. There's a deerskin dress, and there's one for a man I have as well, but I didn't put it on here. And then you got the inside of what a longhouse would have looked like during this time period. And I saw an example of one at a museum in Albany, and they're very spacious and very comfortable, and they were swept with turkey feathers, and the ground was hard as cement. So, and there were all kinds of benches and beds and storage vessels for all this surplus food resources that we had. Furs of all kinds to line these beds and such. It was a fairly comfortable existence living in these structures. You know, language would have continued to develop over these thousands of years, as well as culture and society in general. People had to find a way to get along in order to survive during these time periods, for sure. Another example of some of the tools that were used for hunting and for skinning and for plowing the ground up for planting. You know, everybody had their own, men and women had their own chores, basically. The men did do a lot of the preparation of fields, but women did all the planting and took care of growing corn, beans, and squash, and many other types of food as well. The men hunted, and as you can see in the far left, fished. They had nets and fishing weirs, and it was a very bountiful life that existed at that time. And eventually agriculture came in to place, and like I say, growing corn, beans, and squash, and having these resources that people could store, and in case of a harsh winter or whatever, they had food to eat. Culture and traditions developed to the point where great civilizations developed in this area. Here's an example of a lacrosse game way back then, and longhouses and what they looked like. Pretty cool buildings, really. Some of the clothes that people wore, and the clothes are post-contact type of clothing made out of cloth, but just an example of how well-dressed people were when they had the time and resources to do it. say corn, squash, beans, even grapes were grown, and there was a note in the early 1500s even that these grapes were actually cultivated and taken care of and didn't just grow wild with no care paid to them. Like I say, there's just bountiful resources. Everybody had what they needed, and they thanked the Creator, Kishala for providing everything that was needed to live and have a good life. And it was everyone's duty to thank Kishala the Creator, for this, as well as animals and plants, as they were needed to be able to live. We talked before how children grew up learning certain principles. We call them in Anishinaabe area where we're at today the 7 grandfather teachings, but in Munsee and Delaware they were known as more like 4 of these, but they're all used: honesty, respect, humility, courage, generosity. And these were taught to our young people from birth, how to be good, honest, and generous people. And this way of thinking and living continued on into adult life. We had ceremony known as the Big House Ceremony here in Munsee, and all the way from the East Coast. There's evidence that these ceremonies took place as far back as the middle 1600s, where there's drawings of the Masingwe, the masks that were used in these ceremonies, and how the buildings are constructed. We talked over the past month or so how these ceremonies continued even into the mid-1700s at Asinisink and other places. And even that it was still here in Munsee, where I'm talking from right now, as late as 1840. And we're going to talk more about that specific ceremony here in Munsee at a later time, although we did do it many sessions ago as well. We had our own systems of government, of choosing a chief and counselors. These were people that were considered wise and able. There is often a hereditary aspect to this, as you know, a certain lineage and certain families, but there is also a significant requirement for ability. In addition, it wasn't just heredity. And although heredity probably gave the successors, more understanding and learning from their mentors as they grew up to be men and adults. But sometimes when heredity just wasn't enough, other people who were simply had good ability, skill, and knowledge were chosen for these positions. It was an egalitarian society where everyone was equal. It didn't matter if you were poor or not. There were differences in that area, but it was due to industry, or if you were young or sick or old. Everyone was treated with respect. Women, men, children, everyone. And these, in addition to the governing systems, were family lineages. I'm not too sure how the clan system worked, if it did within the Munsee or Delaware societies. It's very clear there were family lineages, however, that were responsible for certain geographical areas, rivers and streams and planting areas, and they made sure their family lineages had continuous use and access to these areas. which could also be shared in between family lineages. And as well, these family lineages extended both north into the Mohican areas and south into the Munsee-Delaware areas. So there was an incredible interaction, it appears, between the Munsees and the Mohicans and the Munsee-Delawares, and family lineages stretched into these areas as well. In the Delaware society, there's the Unami, Unalactico, and the Munsees, and they were known not so much as clans, but they used as an animal symbol the turtle, the turkey, and the Munsees were the wolf. And it's possible we adopted this identity with the wolf from an old story that existed, that the wolf, during a certain period in time when we were living underground, brought us to the surface to find food. And it kind of suggests that to me that there was a time during a flood, which in 3,000, 4,000, well, probably about 6,000 years ago, quite possibly, there's legends of this flood all the way around the world, and I'm thinking this relates to the same time period for us. Again, in addition to these identification with the turtle, turkey, and the wolf, many of our leaders, when certain documents were signed after contact, did use what's called a totem or a totem to sign their names, and that was often a fish of some kind, a bird, or an animal. Whether that refers to an actual clan, I'm not sure. But like I say, I'm just haven't been able to find out for sure what that situation was all about. So, life was pretty good here during these days before contact from the Ice Age on, as it developed. And there was a lot of interaction between the people, as well as some very extensive trading that went on up and down these river systems, even down into the Gulf of Mexico and up into what's now Canada, and west all the way to the Mississippi. There's evidence of archaeological evidence of items from these areas in some of the sites that have been studied. However, eventually things began to change, and that started to occur when first contact was made with the European people who came first to this continent. And one of them, first records of contact in the New York area, or in the Northeast area from North Carolina to somewhere in Connecticut, was by a sailor by the name of Giovanni de Verrazzano. And he wrote a report to the King of France about his journey along the northeast coast in 1524, and describes a beautiful land and a beautiful people. It's incredible. His observations kind of reflect exactly what I just talked about and showed pictures of, that there was bountiful resources for food, there was lots extensive crops, and even fruit trees, and like I say, grapes, and animals of all kinds, deer and bear, and all kinds of seafood, and rivers full of fish. But he describes his observations, and they're very positive regarding us and about our friendship and hospitality towards him. And that at every stop he made, he was given food and tobacco. Tobacco at every stop. And it was green tobacco, which suggests either it hadn't been cured yet, which I'm sure it would have been cured. You don't just give somebody fresh tobacco. But the thing about it being green is it was likely what's known as Nicotiana rustica in the Latin terms, but that's the traditional tobacco that we grew way back then, because when you do cure it, it doesn't turn brown or golden like what they call Virginia tobacco today. The leaves stay green. So it's interesting that he noted that. But anyway, like I say, we had a good visit with him, and he even said he made good friends with us before he had to sail on, as well as many other incredible descriptions of what the people looked like, what we wore, different hairstyles, and funeral practices, and many other things. Even though he wasn't there a long time, he was there long enough to get a good idea of the type of people we were, and made, like I say, very good friends with us. After he left, there's a couple of records of other ships coming in to this areas over the next 100 years or so. And it appears some of these ships brought not the same type of friendly attitude that Verrazano did, and there is reason to be suspicious of what type of people were on these ships. And then Henry Hudson came into the area in 1609, and he records his observations when he came into New York Harbor. There was actually a bit of some bad things happened. He killed a few people, and one of his men got shot through the neck with an arrow and died. And he went up the Hudson and had better relations, but they were always suspicious, the guys on Hudson's ship, and they would not let people come onto the ship in numbers, maybe one or two at a time, and made sure they didn't go near the shore. They were just very cautious and suspicious, a totally different attitude than shown by Verrazano, who was more of an easygoing, friendly type of person. But maybe Hudson, after these other ships that come in, had reason to be a little bit cautious. Bad experiences. Well, what's interesting about Hudson's voyage, he notes a couple of things, and they're kind of humorous. At one point, he captures a couple of men, puts them on his ship, but they escape by jumping off, and he notes that they turned around when they were swimming and gave him a very rude gesture, and I'm not sure whether that was the finger or not, but it's something to think about. And there was another occasion where he had a bit of a rough time with some native people, and he says they all pulled their trousers down and flashed their buttocks at him. So this is probably the first case of giving the moon in North America, and it's this and other gestures, physical gestures, and different types of sayings that still are used in New York and North America actually come from the people that lived in this area way back when. But John Heckwelder, who we've been talking about, was told the story of this first contact by Munsee's in the 1780s or so, and it describes a very interesting situation about what happened at the time the first ship came into sight and afterwards. And this similar recording of first contact is recorded again in 1849 in a letter from the Munsees in White River, Indiana, to the President Zachary Taylor. So it's an example of how this oral tradition carries on for many, many years after this about first contact. But one of the most important things of this is, again, like Verrazano, we were very hospitable to the people who came into this area. We didn't think of them as enemies, and we wanted to and had an obligation to treat them with respect and hospitality by giving them food and shelter and whatever they needed. At this time as well, though, the attitude of the people coming in on the ships was their, I guess, use of what's called the Doctrine of Discovery, that they were handed down from the kings and queens in the European countries they came from. And these weren't much more than criminal organizations, really, or gangsters, as they've been referred to from things I've read. People, organized crime syndicates, basically, who were all related in one way or another, but decided amongst themselves how they were going to divvy up the spoils of murdering people and taking their stuff when they found it in these adventures they were able to take now that they had these kind of ships to do it in. You know, I'm pretty sure that there was no concept of lying or cheating or deceit among the First Nation peoples that were there when first contact was made, and even hundreds of years later, and even until today in a lot of respects. I guess you could say we're quite uncivilized in this area, not knowing how to do these types of things. However, we were far advanced in the civilization as far as human relations, understanding, and getting along was concerned. We might not have had this technological civilization that could produce large ships and weapons of war and big castles, all built by slaves, basically, European peasants and such. But we did have a very civilized society, which Heckewelder, again, in the 1780s, says that we had the kind of civilization that the philosophers of Europe had long been in search of. And that's just an example of, you know, the type of people that lived in this area and throughout North America, actually, from what I've been seeing and what I've experienced in my lifetime, having lived in all parts of North America among First Nations people, there is this sense of goodness and kindness and generosity for the most part, although it has been impacted by the way we have been treated over the centuries. You know, there's a pattern of friendship, basically, and hospitality, like I say, which was somewhat provided by these folks at first contact as well, but with a knowledge on their part that they would eventually betray us and were deceitful in that. And Paconchahelas, again, talks to Heckewelder in the 1780s all about that. You know, he says there are good people, you know, very good people, but they bear no proportion to the bad. At least during this time of first contact and settlement into the 1700s, at least, you know, there were, like I say, good people, and we're going to talk about some of these folks as we go along, but he said they bear no proportion to the bad, and that the bad must be the strongest, for they rule. He's talking about his knowledge and his experience but not just his own experience, but the knowledge that he's learned over the years as well. Oops, I got the wrong scene here. Darn. Anyway, let's go to this next one. When first contact was made, trade began to develop between the Dutch, in this case, who came into the Manhattan area and called it New Netherland, or New Amsterdam, rather. And this resulted in also the desire for land, and it also ended up in changing our relationship with wampum that we've been using forever, and we'd used it for important diplomacy, understanding and agreements within our own communities or between our own nations, and as well internationally with other First Nations that weren't Munsee or Delaware. Eventually this wampum was turned into money, really, a capitalistic type of product that was used by the Dutch to as a purchase type of product. And eventually, when this man named Kieft, he was the director of the Dutch West India Company, started to use this capitalistic type of attitude towards us, requiring us to give him wampum and corn and other products in exchange for protection, basically a tax, the first tax on First Nations people for what he called protection. And it's almost like, the mafia that we see on TV goes to little stores and tells the store owner, you give me 10% of your weekly money so I'll protect you, and if you don't give me that money, I'll kill you instead. And this is exactly the way Kieft operated, and a couple of other men that he was partners with. And his actions resulted in very serious conflict. And one of those conflicts was the what's known as the Pavonia Massacre. And you'll see on the bottom left, it's a picture of school children reenacting this Pavonia Massacre, which is one of the most horrible and disgusting types of things that people could do to another people. Like I've said before, I'm not going to say the details, but they were provided to this man named De Vries from witnesses who saw it all happen back in 1643. So there's a record of it. Some very horrible stuff that people could do to another people. I'm pretty sure we weren't used to this sort of thing at all. This was all new, this way of dealing with each other, massacres and killing and murder and all this stuff. But these massacres continued for a while. And in the bottom, the middle picture is a picture relating to what's known as the Peach War. And it was started when a woman picked a peach from one of these settlers' trees and was shot for it and killed. It's sort of like the straw that broke the camel's back, in a sense. It was a series of other things that happened before that. And at the top is a drawing of, again, this Pavonia Massacre, which is a little difficult to see, but just horrible stuff. And there were other massacres that happened, including one at a place called Westchester, or Pound Ridge as it's known today, where some 600 to 700 people were burnt to death in their houses at a very important ceremony that was taking place at that time and that location. And again, later in the bottom right, you'll see what's a reference to what's known as the Esopus Wars, which were made upon the Esopus people, Munsee-speaking people on the upper Hudson. And again, it was explained to Yaquawi in the 1780s or so by the Munsees that the people had extinguished our council fire with our own blood. That first they had done it in the north, and then the south, and then in the middle. And it sounds like it refers to these Esopus massacres in the north, probably the Powhatan massacres in the south, and now these massacres at Pavonia and Westchester, where the council fire was put out by our own blood. And Yaquawi in the 1780s would have had no idea what these guys were talking about at all. These things weren't recorded or available to read in any way. He just recorded what people told him. And it's interesting that what they said, there's evidence to show something very similar to that actually occurred. And again, it's just an example of how this oral tradition and history can be carried down over very long periods of time. 7:51, oh my goodness. If we get through tonight. Anyway, should be wearing my glasses too. Anyway, in addition to these massacres and various murders and other bad things that were occurring, disease was a very, very destructive thing that occurred to us. In 1618, disease came throughout the Northeast, decimating villages. In one Massachusetts village, it was recorded that out of 1,000 people in the area, 90% of the people died from this disease during this period. And it's likely other villages experienced the same. It's just at that time there was nobody to keep a record of these things in most of these other villages. These diseases, and they're represented in these pictures and paintings here. Smallpox, a very horrible disease that took periods of time for people to die and resulted in mass decimation of our populations. And it must have just been the most horrible psychological impact you could ever imagine. And you kind of wonder how people could or would even want to carry on after these experiences. And yet we did. And there's more to come after that. So this is an area, the area we're talking about. On the left is a map of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. On the right is the same map, but more close up. And you can see all the villages, the Munsee-speaking villages along the Hudson River there. That pink area is Long Island, and right on the upper left part of that is Manhattan Island, and that's the Hudson River going straight north. And those are all Munsee-speaking villages all the way up to the area known as Kingston, the Esopus area at the top. And if you go over to the far left, you'll see the word Minnesink, and that's where the Minnesinks are from, and where the name Munsee came from to be used to describe all these people in this area. And we did gather together at a point in time in the 1650s to consider taking some retaliation, and there's a record that 1,000 men and some 80 canoes came down the Hudson to Manhattan Island. There was a few homes burned, and some people were killed and taken captive. However, even though we probably could have wiped everyone out at that particular time, that did not occur. If if you take a look at the map on the far right and go all the way up to the top of that light shaded area, you'll see the word Esopus, and that's where the Esopus people lived and where other massacres occurred during the 1750s as well. And I'm not going to get into these maps, but these maps are in the book by Robert Grimet, and they show the various land transactions that took place. This first one here is land transactions when the Dutch were in power in New Amsterdam. And this other one shows the land transactions that took place when the English came in. And then more land transactions. I'm calling them transactions. You know, they were very, they were very underhanded arrangements. And given our issues with disease and massacre and war, we really didn't have the ability to say no to this incredible greed for our lands and the increasing population, and as well the introduction of soldiers and militias into this area at the same time. Many factors were involved in this land losses, as I will call them, and I've described them before. You know, disease. By the 1700, we'd lost 90% of our population from disease, massacres, and various murders and other things. Even alcohol was a bit of had a rather negative impact on us as well. You know, local conflict with settlers and their fencing in their areas and their animals eating our corn. These local things that cause conflict that even still exist around here today. If you try to go hunting in the farmers' woods, they might not like that, and those things occurred even way back then. The increase in settlement coming from Europe to occupy these areas that were being illegally sold to them, thinking they had a right to take them. And as well, the colonists moving into all these towns and such, just numerous issues resulting in the loss of our lands, including deceit, which was a big part of that as well, if not the main part. That, like I say, we being an honorable and respectful people, not knowing these ways and trusting people to be honest in what they said or wrote down, and continuously finding out that's not the case, but thinking maybe people have changed over time and these ones are more honest than the last ones. And it's a pattern that developed, like I say, in addition to when these lands were illegally taken, bringing settlers in to occupy them so that we had no way to move back even if we wanted to. The English moved in 1664 and kicked the Dutch out and took over and called it New York. And the covenant chain was put into place at that time with the 5 nations as they were then, but also the Munsee-speaking people on the Hudson, and likely the Minnesinks were part of that as well. And after this time, we started to become known as the Peacemakers in this environment. We were not known to want to make war on people, although we did respond when we were treated bad, but we never actually made war on anybody, and nobody actually made war on us. And we continued in this peacemaking role until this time period we talked about last week, and even until much more than that in the future. Some of our warriors did join with the 6 nations in going against the French up the Hudson, and some of them joined the 65 Nations and going down what we called the Great Valley into Cherokee country and fighting down there. But there was no village or nation type of policy of declaring war anywhere or anybody doing that against us either during these time periods. Try and move along here. And I'm kind of getting into the late 1600s now. And we were actually noted, a lot of Munsees were noted to be over here in this area below Lake Michigan in the 1680s by this explorer, a French explorer named La Salle, who recorded our being there and who we were. And it's interesting, just this relationship we had with the Great Lakes people, what becomes known as the Western Confederacy, the Anishinaabe peoples as well. Way back then even, and probably hundreds of years even before that. But when we were there, we developed a relationship with the Shawnees, and they actually moved back with us to the area of Minisink on the Delaware River, and we've had a long-standing relationship with them as well since that time. And at one point in the same period, the Anishinaabe peoples came to our area on the Minisink to visit us, but they all actually died from disease at that particular time. Again, there was these waves of disease, and as well, we were hard hit. Many of our young people died from this during this period from disease, and about 10 years later, many of our elderly people died from another disease that hit who didn't have the immunity from these other diseases. It's a very tragic situation, you know, and it must have been horrible for people to have to go through all these things. But because of these thefts of our land and taking of our lands and our decimated populations, the Munsee people on the Hudson here began to be pushed out of these areas and further west into the Delaware River area, into the area of the Minisinks that you see here, and as well, whoops, whoops, okay, and as well into this area in the green area, you'll see Nudimus's town. That's at the forks, close to the forks of the Lehigh and Delaware rivers, and is basically the middle area between Unami and Munsee-speaking peoples. But it appears a lot of those Munsee-speaking peoples on the southern part of the Hudson moved over into this particular area and into the Lehigh River as well. But other Munsee-speaking peoples from the northern part of the Hudson, the Esopus, the Wappingers even, moved into the other northern part of the Delaware, just above the Delaware Water Gap, which is the area known as Minisink. And probably because it was easier geographically for some people to move that way and others to move the other way. But it's just interesting how those movements occurred. Others that lived along the Hudson moved north into the northern Hudson there, into what's known as Shattuck area, and also northeast into where the Abenakis and Penobscots live, and others more up closer to Quebec at a town called Odenac, just south of Montreal. And at the same time, around the same time, the Susquehannocks, as they're known, they're a Haudenosaunee-speaking people, occupied this area just west of the Delaware Water Gap, that green triangle area, which is called the Walking Purchase. But you see the towns of Shamokin and Wyoming, they weren't called that at the time the Susquehannocks occupied that area. But they, in fact, did occupy that area at one time and had lived there for quite some time. However, they were defeated by their relatives, the Five Nations, and absorbed into their societies, as well as other Iroquois or Haudenosaunee-speaking people in Ohio and southwestern Ontario, where I'm at right now. And I think it has to do a lot with disease hitting them as well, and the need to keep their population whole and strong. And they were able to find a way to get these other Haudenosaunee-speaking people to join in with them and adopt them into their societies, where we did not have that ability to do that, and ended up, like I say, losing 90% of our population without any way to make it whole again. We talked over the past about how Menakahikan, the Munsee chief in this Delaware Water Gap area, tried to get the Miamis way over in southern Michigan and the Five Nations to join in pushing these land stealers, these settlers that were taking our land, and land speculators and everybody back into the ocean, actually, and out of this country, which, you know, at that particular time we might have been able to do. However, they did not like the idea, I guess, and he wasn't able to get this strong force together to do that. So we ended all getting pushed further and further west. And a big part of that occurred when this, like I say, this large green triangle area on the Delaware River, it's known as the Walking Purchase, occurred in the 1740s. It was just another land fraud, resulting in us having to move from here over into the Susquehanna area, where the Susquehannocks did not live anymore, but was under Five Nations control because they had defeated the Susquehannocks. And it's interesting that this Walking Purchase, there was a settlement for it in the 1970s about this land fraud that went to Delawares in the U.S., but us as Munsees were not able to share in that. So anyway, it just shows you how, you know, this was an actual land fraud that occurred, and like I say, there's many more of them that resulted in our having to move further and west. So as we lose 90% of our population and our lands, we start to begin to be treated sort of in an inferior sort of way by other peoples, and especially the European colonists that are coming into the area. We don't have the same power and influence that we had at one time, although we do say to the folks in this area that we're not the kind of people that operate that way. Even though one may be stronger and one may be weaker, we still all are equal as governments and independent, self-autonomous societies. So as we lose the lands in the Walking Purchase area, we're forced further west and into this area on the Susquehanna, as I said, at these towns called Shamokin and Wyoming, and on the west branch of the Susquehanna, and all the way up to the northern part of the Susquehanna as well. And Wyoming is a Munsee word, meaning something about where the river crosses the plain. So just a little interesting piece of information there. And then eventually we start to move further west into Katanning on the Allegheny River and up into Venango and French Creek towards Lake Erie. And Logstown on the Ohio River as well. And during the 1740s, 1750s, and 1760s, as we've talked about, a number of these Munsee men become to be important in their societies. They're not chiefs or leaders per se, but they're known as Anawotak, or men who seems to be able to provide the message to the people that they want to hear, and they talk consistently about making sure we continue to keep our traditions and our ways of living and to become less dependent on the European goods, and so we can provide our own resources to live and survive. And this page here shows one of them, the pacifist prophet, Papunhank. There's others such as Neolin, and he's probably the same person who lived at Sinisink, where the Munsees lived on the upper Susquehanna. And there was Wangoman and other Munsee men who brought this message to the people and actually resulted in significant changes taking place in a lot of these towns, including the denial of using alcohol, which was somewhat important and would have an influence on our people for many decades, if not even a century or more to come. However, at the same time, this the French Indian War now starts to begin. It should be called the French-English War, actually, because that's who is fighting this war, and we don't want to have anything to do with it. It's between two European countries, but unfortunately they're both coming from different directions, the English from the east and the French from the west, and we're caught in the middle, the Munsees and the Delawares actually, in these particular areas we're at, and we're getting like this metaphor that's used for the American Revolution by one of our people, where it's like getting caught between a pair of scissors. And if we don't take sides, we're going to get cut in half. So because of the way we've been treated by the English and the colonists in Pennsylvania and Virginia and New Jersey and New York, we decided to take our frustrations out on them by attacking them and somewhat siding with the French, although I don't think we really sided with the French. We just used their moving towards the east as a reason to do the things we did. And we caused a lot of pain and anguish to settlers and to militia and forts during that time. But also, eventually, as we've talked about, this man named T.D. Uskung, who lived in this area on the Susquehanna River in the Wyoming area, he was asked by the government in Philadelphia, and him, through other frontier diplomats, managed to get the various people on the Susquehanna together and start to talk about peace, resulting in peace happening at what's called the Treaty of Easton we spoke about in October 1758. And we also talked about a Munsee man by the name of Igohohoan, who was a signatory of that treaty. And there's another man named Lahakis, who was a chief here where I'm talking from right now. He was killed in the War of 1812. But he's a direct descendant of this man named Agahohoan that we're going to find out more about when we get into that time period of the American Revolution. But, and I was actually able to find a painting of this Igahohoan, at least that's what came up when I did my search. All of the words and description of this painting are in Russian, are in Russian. Yes, even the text of what this painting is about is in Russian, and it's amazing that various paintings like this that are on the internet and other things about it that are actually in Russian. But this painting apparently is a representation of Yaquawi, who I'm just speaking about, who lived on the Upper Susquehanna during this time period. And there's on the right is the picture of T.D.S. Gung, who we've also been talking about and was a significant player in this quest for peace, again continuing this tradition of peacemaking that the Munsees had been at for quite some time. At the same time, there's a number of Munsees and Delawares living, having moved further west, down the Allegheny into this area known as the Koskuskis. And as I mentioned, a great meeting occurred there between the Western Confederacy, the Anishinaabe people, and the Delawares, who are recognized as grandfathers by them. And peace was made with the English as well during that time. And after the Treaty of Easton, it appears we did join the English and fighting the French. And in records from here, where I'm talking from now, in the 1840s, we mentioned that we assisted the English in throwing the French on their backs and in scaling the walls of Quebec, which in this lower right picture shows these cliffs that had to be climbed in order to get the Plains of Abraham. And it's exactly what we said when we talk about having to scale the walls of Quebec. But at the same time as after the French-Indian War, which ended in September 1760, it kind of opened the door for more settlers and soldiers to start moving into these areas we'd been living in. And much friction developed, and certain hatred actually develops by these settlers against us for reasons we're going to talk about more down the road. One part of this attitude comes from the British themselves when their policy changes towards us, and especially at the hands of this officer named Jeffrey Amherst, who we're going to find out does some pretty dastardly things as well. But this policy is like, we've conquered you. They conquered the French, for sure, but now their attitude is we've conquered you too. And this results in him halting trade goods to us, guns and powder and lead to hunt and other utensils needed to cook food and do the regular things in life that are needed. Even though we are trying to be less dependent on these things, it's still quite essential at this time, and results in a certain desperation amongst the First Nations at this period, and results in an alliance between the Delawares, the Six Nations, the Western Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe peoples to start thinking about how we're going to respond to this. And we certainly do. And we're going to get into that next week when we get into Pontiac's War. Almost done. Almost done. 8:20. Oh my God. Anyway, as we kind of ended up last time, T.D.S. Gung, after all his work and getting peace made and having begun a certain understanding that he'd be able to continue to live at this area known as Wyoming with his people, he starts to realize that these settlers that buy land from what's known as the Susquehanna Company, and they're all from Connecticut, they start moving into this area on the Delaware River known as Minisink, where we were originally from. And there's conflict between these land speculation companies, almost wars in themselves, and they're all fighting each other. for land, just like they're trying to kill us for it. So, eventually these settlers, these Connecticut settlers, start moving over into this area known as Wyoming in the Susquehanna Valley. And in April of 1763, T.D. Eskong, who's living there with all his people, is burnt to death in his cabin by these settlers. And his people ended up having to move from this area, and the Connecticut settlers simply move in. And again, this is an example of the pattern that has been going on for quite a while. You know, through the history you read from their point of view, it seems like we're the instigators in all these horrible events, and they took action in retaliation against us for doing these bad things. But it was really the other way around. After endless and decades of abuse by these colonial governments and settlers, and like I said before, it was finally the straw that broke the camel's back that made us have to actually take up the war hatchet against them. So we're going to get more into that and this continuing series of events that occur from what we've been talking about. There's Pontiac's War that comes along, Lord Dunmore's War, the American Revolution, the Indian Wars, the War of 1812, and even the Fenian Raids. You know, it's sad that a lot of this is about war and violence, but it's a fact that these are the things that occurred and that we had no choice but to be involved in. We'll try and get glimpses again, like what life was like in our villages during these times as well. But it looks like a significant part of it will be our involvement to survive and keep our people safe. So anyway, we've had a long journey tonight from 14,000 before the present until the year 1763. Basically and generally what we've gone over the past year. Like I said, there's just so much more information out there. It's impossible to provide all the details. We'd be here for the next 20 years doing that probably. So anyway, we'll continue on next week, and I'll say Lapish Kanao Olomwa. Have a good evening, and we'll see you next Sunday. Anishik.